Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
When my legs and arms ached with growing pains as a boy, my grandmother pulled out her bottle of rubbing alcohol, a muddy brown oil of soaking leaves. Strong smell of healing rose when she opened the green bottle, tipped it in her large palms, rubbed me down with the leaves, black shreds of wet skin, shining pieces of strong branches. Overpowering plants fermented in a bottle that carried a dark swamp, a fire that cured me as hot hands traced leaves across my trembling arms, covered my legs like a small animal wrapping itself around the smoking trees. When my legs and arms ached, I went into that cloud of curing, fumes of touch transforming my pain into a hidden bone of passage, a throat-clearing odor that burned me with secrets I cannot say.
Welcome to this segment of Northern Lights, and a special welcome to Ray Gonzalez, eminent man of letters who exemplifies every possible application of the craft of literature. He is the author of 5 books of poetry, including Turtle Pictures, winner of the 2001 Minnesota Book Award. He's the author of a book of autobiographical essays, the editor of at least 11 anthologies, ranging with all kinds of topics from machismo and Latino culture, erotica, contemporary poetry. The list is long. He's the editor of Luna, a literary magazine, specializing in poetry, and he is a professor at the University of Minnesota. Obviously, your path from El Paso to Minnesota has been interesting. Would you give us a little bit of an overview of that, as well as your early influences, insights that helped make you a poet?
Well, I've been gone from the Southwest for about 25 years, but lived in different parts of the country. And I think the main place during that time was Denver, Colorado, where I lived for about 12 years. And that's really where I started to see that a writer with my background coming from the desert Southwest and writing his poems and stories very much alone, a writer really only sees half of the writing life. And in Denver, I found the other half: publishing, editing, met people at the Bloomsbury Review that were doing journals. And so I learned that whole other public side of being a writer, discovered a literary community there in Denver that was very active. So that's really how I got started. And then in the early 90s, I moved back to Texas, to San Antonio, worked for a literary arts center there, was still doing my projects, doing many anthologies from the writers that I had met through the magazine. And then one day went back to school, got my MFA, and have been teaching now for about 5 years. So I feel fortunate that my combination, I guess, of being a writer in the community and then a writer, in academia, kind of gives me that balance that hopefully I can offer to my writing students.
One of your recent activities were this month, October of 2001, the Friends of the St. Paul Library are sponsoring the Chicano Latino Writers Festival. I understand you're on the board of that as well as a participant. How do you perceive the value of the festival to the Latino community and maybe to a larger audience?
Well, I think the Twin Cities is such a thriving literary community that it's important to get different aspects of the literary vitality that we have here. And the Twin Cities have also a growing Latino population. And through the Friends, they combine bringing well-known Latino writers from out of town with several local writers, poets, nonfiction writers, novelists. And I think it's important because you get to see that literary community comes from different places, different cultures. One aspect that I really enjoy, and it's one reason that I offered to help them, is that they take the writers and bring them into the schools, the public schools, the high schools, community centers, and that encourages young kids in St. Paul and in Minneapolis to maybe want to write poems, do stories, work with children's authors. And so that's a very important aspect of it, and I think it also gives people in the community in St. Paul, for example, a chance to be exposed to writers that maybe they're not going to find, again, in the larger, active, local literary community.
Interesting. Getting into the specifics of your Minnesota Book Award winner, Turtle Pictures, the image of the turtle evokes a mythic sense, although nothing yet to me specifically. What can you tell us about the turtle within the context of your work and your thinking?
Well, of course, in Native religion and myth, Turtle Island is the phrase for the larger continent, the home of the people that were here. Later on, poets like Gary Snyder, his prize-winning book Turtle Island, tried to show that yes, those native cultures and roots are still here, but as you come from other places or another culture comes in, there's that clash between cultures, but in the middle of that, the ongoing poetic sense that things continue, that they never end. Turtle Pictures is about the U.S.-Mexican border and how volatile a place it is with political problems, immigration problems, environmental problems. And yet in the middle of it, it's a very thriving cultural community that combines both the English and the Spanish. So to me, the idea of Turtle Pictures, the picture thing is really like a contemporary look or snapshots of how all of these clashing identities and problems really create the Mexican-American character right on the border, and that in many ways underneath all of those modern problems there's still that ongoing myth and culture and language that keeps Latino culture very much alive.
The book has a very interesting structure, I found. There are chapters divided as shells, and then there are interior, shorter chapters more specific to contemporary reality. Would you elaborate on what you were thinking when you structured your book?
I guess one reason I did it that way, it came out at the end of the century, the whole idea of the new millennium, and I wanted to show how often in order for poets, prose writers, whatever kind of writer you are, to sustain your culture, to write about family myths and histories and personal experiences, it takes a long period of time. And I think with the different forms in Turtle Pictures, like the short prose poems, the longer narrative poems, some of the nonfiction short pieces in there, I wanted to show that so much history has been compacted into maybe the last 20 or 30 years, where there's more of a national audience for Latino history and culture, but yet it goes back into time. So I tried to divide the book into sections where I dealt with some of my own family history, and later on in the book, some of the social, not stereotypes, but social expectations of where, Mexican-American people were going. Finally, in the end of the book, that in order for Latino culture at large to progress, you really have to stop and look back at your origins and your customs and your traditions and understand those in order to move forward. And I think that's why I divided the book like that.
Good. There's a sense in the poetry in Turtle Pictures that you're broaching or entering a deeper sense of imagery. Can you comment on that? Is this deliberate, or is this something that is happening?
I think it was very deliberate in this book. It's one reason why I combined linear poetry with prose poems and short fictions. In a way, it represents that as the Latino culture, Mexican-American identity has moved forward and expanded throughout the country and throughout the idea of America, that a lot of it is still very fractured. And again, back to the motif of the turtle, to kind of slow down and look at where you came from. Also, the fact that it's a book set in the Southwest, the desert landscape is a very surrealistic, unusual, overpowering, dominant visual force that for many writers that come from there, you can't help but integrate it into your writing because it's just so overpowering. So it's a combination of the current state of the culture as it evolves, and also that natural world of the desert Southwest that really influences the kind of writing, the style, that I do.
Well, you've said in interviews that your poems tend to come when they're ready, that you don't try to force the issue or the specific image. How would you describe this state of poetic readiness?
Well, I think a lot of it, and you mentioned that I've worked in different genres and some of the editing and so forth. And when I discovered that public side of being a writer, organizing literary events, working in a literary community, editing and publishing, I knew that the more I did that, that my own creativity was still developing, that I could do some of the public sides of being a writer, and that the poems would come. So to me, part of that poetic process, where not that I wait for the poem, but they just happen, has to do with what I do in my day-to-day life as a writer, as a teacher, as an editor. There's also the idea for many other writers that you have to go sit down and force it out of you, and there's been times, with prose where I can do that, but for poetry, I think my day-to-day life just brings those poems and creates them.
Do you set aside a time each day when you say, now I'm Ray Gonzalez, the poet, and see what happens, or does the poem strike you whenever?
They usually just strike me whenever. I can usually write poems just about any time, even though with my busy schedule and teaching and doing the magazines that I do, often in the morning is a good time for working on poems and revising things and working in my notebook or typing things up on the computer. Prose, I can sit down and write prose just about any time. I could sit at the computer and compose prose all day if I really force myself to do it. So that can be, that kind of has a certain freedom, but with poetry I still, write in my notebooks by hand and still have to find that special space to create the poems.
How long does it take for a poem to be, let's say, born, ready for the page or for the voice?
Well, I think in recent years I've been writing poems at a quicker pace, and I think that all the prose that I've been doing, the essays and some of the short stories, has kind of accelerated the pace of the poems. But I still have to go back through my notebooks, through different drafts, and sometimes it could take several days for a short poem. It could take several weeks for a longer poem. It really depends. I also know many poets that can write one poem a day every single day, or others that go through a long period of time and all of a sudden 20 or 30 will come out in 2 weeks. So it really just depends on how you integrate your daily life and how you work with the language.
How would you describe your mental, emotional state when the poet kicks in versus the rest of your busy life?
In a way, a quieter process that's going on, in a way kind of slowing down and really being very careful with the language. I said that I can compose prose rather quickly, and I've done a lot of journalism, and so that's helped. I think with prose, so much information, I'm putting together a lot of information. I'm also maybe asking myself certain questions as I'm writing the essays. And with poetry, it's just a slower, evolution of the language, where it's almost like a gift that you're rewarding yourself by working on a poem, when over here you've been working on 5 essays that have been taking months and months, and again, a faster speed of thought and writing and revision and so forth.
Do you write, does the intense moment cause you to sit down and be the poet, or do you recollect in tranquility, as Wordsworth used to put it?
Often I have to go back and think about, how I've perceived certain things. I keep a little notebook. I don't always carry it, but often many of the poems, when I feel that a poem is going to take shape, many of those poems come from fragments that I wrote a few days ago or the previous week, or I've taken fragments from a different point in time and put them together. And again, I really don't know when they're going to come out, but you kind of sense it. And again, with prose, it's very different. It's almost like a mechanical organizing of the material. So, there's a difference there.
A look at your poetic work throughout the last few years reveals both change and a direct, continuous line. I would hope you would read to us from your previous book, Cavato Santora, and maybe comment on what that book was like prior to your work of in Turtle Pictures.
Well, the poems in Cavato Santora, and I mentioned this to people when I talked about that book, it's almost like farewell poems to the Southwest about family and history and myth, many of the things in Turtle Pictures, but it was almost like the last book I wrote where I felt I was really there as somebody that grew up there. Turtle Pictures, in its complexity with the prose poems and the mixture of genres, it's like a book written from a distance, a book where, yes, I went back and forth and traveled there and did some research, but Turtle Pictures is like an overview of a larger history, and Cavato Santora is more personal, more immediate family and autobiographical things that happened. So in many ways, Cavato Santora is a farewell to that family history. Turtle Pictures is like an overview of a place where I used to live, and I guess, you know, that's the difference.
Would you read now from Cavato Santora?
Sure. They look like miniature orange and brown tigers clinging to the concrete blocks in the backyard. Two lizards looking up at me as I lift the wood off their hiding place. They stick to the bricks, flatten themselves except for their heads and enlarged eyes. Tiny faces looking curious and human, staring at me when I move, blinking as if I were going to grab them. One of them suddenly springing out of the brick, disappearing into the grass to lead me away from their nest. Two striped lizards are a good omen for the man who knew the reptiles that led him to the well. Two striped lizards are signs of abundant thirst, plenty of water, their rapid movement and caution leaving me with something to grab, a blade of grass, an abandoned spider web. A concrete block I can't move because I learned what those striped lizards mean. A tiger in the canyon is as good as the escaped dragon of the heart. The second lizard not moving as I leave it alone, close the lid on the muffled source of its trembling.
Now, you've referred to the inner image of the poet in some previous interviews and conversations. Can other poets recognize the same phenomena within themselves? And how is it different? How is the inner image different from just the imagery that we all draw upon when we do our writing?
Well, I think many of these things are common to novelists, short story writers, essayists, but I think in talking to many poets over the years, there's always a recurring visual memory that poets carry. In my case, it could be the desert Southwest, it could be the Rio Grande River, whatever. For other poets in the Midwest or on the West Coast, it could be the ocean, whatever. But often poets, regardless of what they write about, I think they start from a visual memory of where they came from, where they grew up, maybe a place where they lived for a very long time. And so I think poets, you always carry that memory with you, and often it's a very visual, imagistic sense. Even if the poem is a conversational poem, a narrative poem, it's set in the past, it's set in the present, many poets that I talk to say that there's always a visual memory, and then once you begin to shape the poem, that visual memory is transformed into the images that you place into the poem, into the emotion that you use, even the tone and the point of view that appears in the poem.
And speaking of this inner image, you're very close spiritually, I believe, to your roots and to your Chicano Texas heritage. Considering all the elements that define ethnicity, what part does the Spanish language play in your work?
Well, coming from the U.S.-Mexican border, I learned a real mutation of Spanish, a combination of English and Spanish, not a pure traditional Spanish. And that also has influenced that surrealistic view of the world, where language on the border is very bilingual. It's like a third language. It's not pure Spanish. It's not pure English. And perhaps in the poetry and the stories and the essays that I write, it reflects that I come from a very unique place. And today that shows, you know, all the different things that are going on right there, you know, on the border.
True. Let's move a little bit to your short fiction, The Ghost of John Wayne, a collection of short stories due out October 25th, 2001 from University of Arizona Press. Is this your first foray into formal fiction of any length?
It is, and many of the characters that I created, in a way, come from that visual memory of the Southwest, because all the stories in the book are set there, like the poems. But I wanted to play with that family history. I wanted to play with memories of the people that I knew, and so, you know, the freedom to create characters and plots and settings was, you know, an opportunity that probably I couldn't take as a poet, even though there is a section of short 2-page short pieces that I think also, you know, tie into the poems.
How do you approach fiction versus poetry? You've said that the poem happens to you. Do you follow the story more actively?
I think I do, and it also gives me a chance to reinforce one of the characteristics of the culture that I come from, and that's the art of storytelling. And often in the poems, I think many poets, you want to tell a story, but a poem is so brief where you just catch those pictures, you know, like the turtle pictures. But in the short stories, I really feel that I'm telling a story. I'm going beyond the visual, beyond that central image, beyond that moment of perception, and I can continue and develop. And even in a short story, you're still doing that. You're trying to tell a story. And maybe you gain more freedom than maybe a poet has. Even though today there's a fine line, I think, between, you know, poetry and a lot of short fiction.
I noticed in some of your stories a very clear, almost spiritual, magical element. There's that wonderful one of the man that eats the scorpion, the boys eating chiles, jalapenos. Is there something there that I should be catching, or that the reader should be aware of in this ingestion and materialization of a higher state?
I think often with Southwest culture, desert culture, Mexican-American culture, there's many stereotypes and separations of, for example, you mentioned the scorpions, that scorpions are very dangerous, stay away from them. Jalapenos is something you spice your food with. And in these stories I tried to show that the source of being alive and appreciating that environment of the desert really comes from many different places, whether it's a dangerous creature or a certain kind of food or a certain cultural myth. In the stories I try to combine all of those to show that maybe that energy and that spirit can come from many of those things that we're supposed to stay away from.
Would you speak possibly a word of conclusion on how you see yourself in the greater scope of American letters? I mean, you are a Latino poet, man of letters. There's a whole world out there. How do they fit in?
Well, maybe 10 years ago, the so-called Latino boom was really active. More Latino writers got published. I think many of them are still being published. In a way that's kind of slowed down. I think most Latino writers that I know today are part of the American mainstream literature. More of their books are being read and studied and imitated and have been influential. I did a lot of anthologies that are now being used as textbooks, and to me that's very satisfying. So hopefully I've been able to contribute something now, being a teacher, doing the magazine, and you know, hopefully I'm giving something back to the community that's been very supportive of what I've done, and also, you know, reaching a point where through the teaching I can give, you know, and return some of those gifts back.
I'm sure you are, Ray. Thank you. I consider this brief conversation a gift, and I think it will be enjoyed by our viewers of Northern Lights.
Well, thank you. Each night the Gila monster enters the house of the daughter, lies down in the exception of water, and disappears for 45 years. Each morning the hangman comes down off the tree and enters the town. Each whisper memorized, his footsteps sounding like his children finally forgive him and call him Father. Each evening the blind crosses are torn off the church walls, piled in a tower that never falls until the tired ones stop breathing and ignite those flames. Each night the horizon praises its own beauty and disappears, arrives as dawn before the stricken country recognizes this threat of mountains lying between one storm and that one morning flower.
My name is Eric Watson. I'm the program coordinator for the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, and we're pleased to present the 5th annual Chicano and Latino Writers Festival this year in November of 2001. This festival was begun 5 years ago in 1997 on the west side neighborhood of St. Paul. And the idea was to celebrate Chicano and Latino culture, which has made such a great contribution to this neighborhood and also to the world of literature. The series has been a great success, drawing up to 1,000 people per year, and we've been lucky to host some of the best-known Chicano and Latino authors writing today, including Isabel Allende and Gary Soto, and also some of our great local writers like Sandra Benitez, Ray Gonzalez, and George Rabasa. The 2001 series features some local authors who are just publishing their first work, including Teresa Ortiz, whose book is called Never Again, A World Without Us, and also a group of writers called Mujeres Hispanas en Acción, whose forthcoming book will be called Buscando un Nuevo Horizonte.
Maria's mother, an old woman in her 80s, with long white braids and the traditional dress of her hometown in the Highlands, sat in her favorite wooden chair shelling corn. Maria's adult daughter was lying in a hammock, swinging for a few precious lazy moments before going back to her daily household chores. Her job was to care for a half-dozen children, to clean, wash, sweep, cook, to grind the corn and the coffee beans, to carry wood from the forest, and to carry water from the river. In a few moments, she would have to start dinner for her family and her guests.
We feel the Chicano and Latino Writers Festival is a great community service that helps to establish connections between the public library and the people in the community.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.